So Regan, I think I'll turn it over to you. Today we have Regan Smyth, our Vice President for Data and Methods here at NatureServe, who's going to be sharing with us what it takes to know where and how to act to protect North American biodiversity. So Regan, take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Karen. I'm Regan Smyth. I'm NatureServe Vice President for Data and Methods. And really what I want to do today is take you behind the scenes a bit and tell the story of what it takes on a day-to-day basis to provide gold standard information for biodiversity in the United States and Canada. I'm going to spend some time introducing you to different NatureServe and NatureServe Network staff, share what motivates us, and explains what we need to do when we show up in the morning every day to provide the information that's used really to affect conservation. We will start, briefly of addressing our why, right? Why the biodiversity crisis is so important. To spend most of the time describing the work that NatureServe does to address that crisis, and then end by providing a few examples of how that work is empowering action on the ground. Hopefully, as Karen said as well, leaving some time for question and answers. So before I go ahead and launch into the nuts and bolts of what we do, I do want to talk a little bit more broadly about our why. I think we're all here on this webinar today because we agree that biodiversity matters, but it matters more than perhaps sometimes even we the advocates out there think. Every year the World Economic Forum releases a report on global risks. And in those reports, biodiversity loss is consistently identified right up there with climate action failure as a risk that falls both on the highest spectrum for impact and for likelihood. And this is because the natural world around us is not just inspiring and beautiful, but it is life-sustaining. Biodiversity through individual species and complex ecological processes is what feeds us and clothes us and shelters us. It provides materials for the goods we consume. It provides innovation for medical advances. And it's what will buffer us against climate disaster. The good news right now is that the world really seems to be paying attention. There are new governmental commitments to stemming biodiversity loss coming out of COP15, and with certain Biden administration initiatives. There's new corporate requirements and corporate interest in measuring biodiversity impacts and progress towards a nature-positive future. But to address this global risk and work towards that nature-positive future, we need good information. And that's the service that NatureServe is here to provide. I think there's often a temptation to look at reports like that and think, say, yeah, that's true. We really do need to go save those rainforests. But the truth is the species and ecosystems right here in our own backyard are similarly at risk. This map, which NatureServe released in 2022 and was highlighted in the New York Times, shows areas of conservation need right here in the United States. From the incredible freshwater stream systems of Appalachia to the incredible botanical richness of the desert Southwest, we're losing species right here at home and seeing declines in the functionality of ecosystems. Recently, NatureServe released a report for the United States summarizing the information we track. And what did those data tell us? In the United States, 34% of plants and 40% of animals are at risk of extinction, and 41% of ecosystems are at risk of range-wide collapse. What I want to talk to you about today is how do we even know what's at risk? And even more importantly, how do we know where and how to act to mitigate that risk? To understand the biodiversity crisis and to target our response, these are critical questions to answer. Those of you who've attended one of these previous webinars may recognize this graphic. It provides a really useful framework for how we organize ourselves to provide that critical information. As a network of programs following similar methods and with shared data management systems, we collect information on local species and ecosystems. At NatureServe, we curate that data. We ensure it meets basic standards, is consistent, and can be used together. We calculate or analyze that data to derive new insight and create information products that practitioners can use. And we communicate that knowledge so those who need it have it to affect positive conservation outcomes. That's the really broad overview of what we do and how, but I'm going to show you what it looks like in practice, starting at the beginning with that data collection step. With more than 60 member programs across the US and Canada, the NatureServe network has the boots on the ground, over 1,000 conservation professionals who are out there collecting information on what's going on with North American species and ecosystems. The botanists and zoologists and ecologists in our network are those human sensors out in the field collecting basic information on the life around us. I want to introduce you to just a couple of those people. Will Orndorff is the Karst Protection Coordinator for the Virginia Natural Heritage Program. Much of Will's time is spent muddy in the dark and underground, managing and conducting a biological inventory of Virginia's caves. Thanks to Will's effort, several new to science species have been identified. One of those is the Lee County cave isopod, which is shown in that picture at the bottom. You might be looking at and thinking, is that something I really care about protecting? But it truly is a unique element of life on Earth and is recognized as a federally listed endangered species. The caves of Virginia are home to an incredible amount of rare species. You can think what you want of the appeal of that particular little guy, but that genetic diversity exists nowhere else on the planet, and it cannot be replicated. It's through the work of Will and other heritage biologists that we understand the value of these unique systems. Will's work on isopods and other at-risk species like bats has allowed Virginia to develop a larger and more representative database, which the state actively uses to prioritize conservation decisions. When Will isn't deep in the mud, he spends significant time working with regulators and developers and agencies like the Virginia Cave Board to implement strategies to reduce human impacts on karst resources. Moving west and switching from animals to plants, this is Kenda Herman. Kenda is a botany data assistant with NatureServe's program in Montana, the Montana Natural Heritage Program. And she's a great example of the dozens of botanists and data managers in the network who are taking the pulse of the foundation of the natural communities around us. And that is North America's plants. Sometimes in the course of her work, Kenda's own pulse gets raised as well. This summer, Kenda was out doing field work evaluating habitat for water howellia, a vulnerable plant. The picture on the bottom of this slide was taken by Kenda's field assistant while they were doing that survey, just after the two of them inadvertently crossed the path of a mama grizzly bear. The bear actually charged her. Luckily, she had the presence of mind to, pull out her pepper spray, stopped it in its tracks. She and her partner were able to, slowly pick up their field gear back out of the wetland as the bear and its two cubs started contentedly munching again on the wetland plants. Surveying our natural world like Kenda does is interesting and exciting stuff. But even the water howellia is a pretty interesting plant. It's found in seasonal wetlands, and thanks to dedicated efforts, it was recently removed from the endangered species list. Andrea Pipp, a colleague of Kenda's at the Montana program, is cited by the Fish and Wildlife Service as one of the conservation partners responsible for water howellia's recovery success. Andrea had her own brush with carnivorous field hazards this summer when she was out doing a survey for the plant, and not one but two mountain lions sprang out of the brush beside her field vehicle when they showed up for the day's field work. Those sort of fun stories aside, the efforts our NatureServe network programs put in across the states and provinces are what provide us with the necessary information to understand natural life in North America. Through field surveys and specimen review and collaboration with other data collectors, members of the NatureServe network have documented over 1 million distinct records of occurrences of elements of conservation significance. This includes both species and ecosystems, plants, pollinators, and invertebrates alongside those bears and mountain lions. I mentioned those less charismatic species because NatureServe's network fills a really important niche there. To truly understand biological diversity and our natural heritage and the building blocks of life that form the basis of the food chain and which are going to allow the planet to evolve, we need information on all of it. So what happens to that information next? Alone, it can only tell us so much, but taken together, we start to understand and be able to address the conservation needs of the US and Canada. And that's where NatureServe's role as a data curator comes in. NatureServe and most of our member programs use a specially designed software system called Biotics to manage that data and ensure that it can be accessed and evaluated together. Local instances of Biotics are used by data managers like Kenda to log field data and other local records. Here at NatureServe, we maintain a central version of Biotics where we strive to keep global information on species and ecosystems up to date and complete. That's information on classification and taxonomy and conservation status, ecology and life history, species management. Keeping that information up to date takes an incredible amount of work. Through a data exchange process, local data flows up to NatureServe and global biotics data flows back to those state and provincial partners. This helps those programs understand the larger context for species in their jurisdictions, and it enables information from states and provinces to come together and support multi-jurisdictional applications. The Science Information Resources team at NatureServe manages those central data resources. They do all that hard work of maintaining that. Our crack software development team makes sure that that system continues to work smoothly and builds new tools to facilitate better data sharing and quality control. They also build tools shown on the other side of this diagram to get that information into the hands of people using it to make conservation decisions. That was a whole bunch of words. So I want to introduce you to a few more people. This is Dave Haber, our principal software engineer. Dave and his team are what keep that wheel on the last side spinning. When he's not writing codes for our biotic system or organizing the priorities of his team, Dave literally keeps people spinning. He's been calling square dances in DC since 2011, and last year he helped the DC Square Dance Collective officially incorporate as a 501c3 nonprofit. In what's left of his time, Dave also plays guitar in an old-time string band that's named Thunder Possum, which I think might be the most NatureServe-y band name I've ever heard of. Working with Dave is Maggie Wu, who's another one of our great software engineers and one of NatureServe's oldest employees in tenure, not age. That's Maggie in the center of the big picture here at NatureServe's first official all-staff meeting in 2001. Her tenure, though, predates even that, though. She joined the Nature Conservancy as an intern in 1986, just when what would become NatureServe and the Natural Heritage Network was starting to form. For a while, Maggie left us for the worlds of startups and contracting, only to return in 2019 because she couldn't pass on the opportunity to try to solve the big challenging problem of how to manage species taxonomy. I realize that probably does not sound very exciting from the outside, but it's a central challenge for the work we do. For information to flow together and be useful for conservation, we need a common language in a world where the science is constantly changing and evolving. Maggie's one of the behind the scenes superstars who does that unglamorous work and does so with creativity and skill and passion. When I asked Maggie, why she wanted to come back and work for NatureServe and what got her excited about the organization, what she wrote to me was this, which I think resonates with many of us on staff. At NatureServe, there's no complacency, and I go to sleep at night feeling like I make a positive impact on the world and the people who inhabit it. One of the great things Maggie and Dave recently achieved is a release of what we refer to by the catchy moniker of the local to central biotics data exchange workbench. You're probably all thinking, what the heck is this and why am I looking at it and why should I care? But you're just gonna have to trust me that it's really exciting. The workbench automatically pushes updates from central biotics out to all our network programs, and forming local programs if, for example, the species name of that they're using locally is now out of date. Soon, data will be flowing the other way as well, allowing records from state programs to flow back up to NatureServe in near real time. It's through tools like this that we're able to efficiently QC and exchange data, so all our member programs have that up-to-date information at their fingertips, and information from programs can flow more seamlessly together. When that happens, this is what you get. This map shows where members of our network have delineated areas of conservation significance for species in the US and Canada. Those 1 million data points that I mentioned in a previous slide. This map represents the best confirmed knowledge of areas of importance for conserving at-risk species in North America. Data exchange brings a lot of information together, but how do we use it to direct conservation? One of the first questions we must answer is what's at risk? This gets us to the calculate step of our data to decisions life cycle. There's several ways staff analyze information, but one of the most important is calculating conservation status rank, work that largely falls to our zoology and botany staff. Tara Cornelise is an invertebrate zoologist and one of the newer members of NatureServe science team. Tara has a PhD from UC Santa Cruz, and before joining NatureServe, she worked with the Fish and Wildlife Service reintroducing an endangered tiger beetle to restored habitat. As our invertebrate zoologist, most of her time is spent reviewing data from our network and other scientific studies to determine the conservation status of insects, the bugs, the backbone of life that surround us. Amanda Eberly is a research botanist who fills a similar role, but for our botany program. When she's not out there collecting observations on iNaturalist or harvesting vegetables from her impressive garden with her adorable son, Amanda provides expertise on North America's rare plants. That includes plants like the Mid-Atlantic beak sedge, which is shown at the bottom, which Amanda recently helped identify as a new and critically imperiled species. It's one of 32 critically imperiled species in my home state of Maryland. But how do we even know that that species is critically imperiled, right? I want to take a minute to talk to you about our process for that. NatureServe's conservation status assessments provide a standard means to evaluate what's at risk and are relied upon by various conservation actors to determine what needs attention and investment. Conservation status ranks range from secure, a 5 on our 5-point scale, to 1 for something that's critically imperiled, like Amanda's recently described plant. There are also statuses to describe species that are no longer with us, extinct in the wild, or presumed extinct. We determine the conservation status using a well-defined methodology that takes into account a variety of factors. Those include how rare something is. That's where those aggregated occurrence records come in. Understanding the range and the population sizes within that range helps us understand what the global extinction risk is. Understanding threats and population trends is also really important. For an example of how this works in practice, we can take a look at the piping plover, whose conservation status has been assessed globally as being vulnerable. The plover is a pretty widespread species with a range that extends across the United States, and so its score is pretty low for rarity. However, it faces significant threats: human disturbance of nesting sites, predation, development pressure. If you've spent any time in Atlantic beaches, you've likely seen interventions to mediate those threats, like fenced-off habitat areas. The good news is current population trends are looking up. So for that trend rank factor, things are going in the right direction. Those fences are doing the trick, preventing the species from falling closer towards imperilment or a G2 or G1 status. Perhaps one day the status could even be downgraded to secure. But because we knew the status in the first place, appropriate intervention was possible. Unfortunately, there's many species that aren't doing as well. I started this presentation with a statistic that 40% of US animals and 34% of plants are at risk, have a conservation status of imperiled or vulnerable. This graph breaks down that information even further for animals based on what's in our databases. What we see is that large numbers of species in the United States really are imperiled or critically imperiled, and that charismatic species like the birds and mammals actually are doing better than some of the less charismatic species, the freshwater invertebrates, the terrestrial snails and amphibians. We also see that there's many species that we haven't yet even been able to assess. That's the work that Amanda and Tara and others on our staff and in our network, with support of people on this call today, are able to do and able to provide that understanding. We perform similar conservation status assessments for ecosystems, allowing conservation initiatives to be focused not just on those individual species, but on ecosystems that support many species in one location. Working with our network, we conduct those assessments at multiple scales, globally looking at the overall extinction risk for the species, but also nationally for what we refer to as subnations, states and provinces. While the plover is globally vulnerable, here in Maryland, it's critically imperiled. These subnational status assessments help direct resources and guide state wildlife action plans, enabling effective conservation planning. The information we collect in the conservation status assessment process also helps us understand threats. This chart summarizes information stored in our biotics database to identify the top threats to plants, terrestrial animals, and freshwater animals. Those include invasives and disease, pollution, climate change. The understanding we provide on threats, coupled with the data we maintain on where species occur, can pinpoint where conservation interventions are likely to have the greatest good. This map shows where, for example, you find multiple at-risk species that are adversely affected by the threat of dams. If you're looking for where investments in dam removal and hydrologic restoration can have the greatest biodiversity benefits, this map is telling you to look towards Southern Appalachia and the Gulf Coast. The map is a good segue to the next section, where I want to share with you a bit more about the work NatureServe does to direct conservation action. That is, how do we answer the question of where and how to act? For that, I want to introduce you to this guy. This is Chris Tracy, NatureServe's Director of Spatial Analysis. Chris leads NatureServe's team of spatial analysts and ecological modelers. He breaks his back to answer that where question and to deliver knowledge products that are used by a whole variety of partners. He was breaking his back at 3 a.m. a few nights ago trying to fix a software bug that was preventing us from publishing a new ecosystem map we're working on to an online review tool. That tool is going to get that data into the hands of our network of experts so they can help us review it and improve our mapping. Chris literally broke his back several years ago when, during his tenure at the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program, he slid down a crumbling cliff face on the banks of Lake Erie while he was out surveying for rare plants. I think if you take anything away from this presentation, it should be to be careful when surveying for rare plants. The reason I wanted to include Chris, though, is because I think he really epitomizes the best of NatureServe. An amazingly dedicated staff who feel our mission to their core, who lose sleep over it, who break vertebrae over it, and who have natural history, expertise, and appreciation coupled with deep technical expertise that allows us to do amazing things in service of conservation. One of the programs under Chris is our ecological modeling, species habitat modeling program. This team takes the occurrence data collected by our network and uses it to develop habitat models for species of concern. The occurrence data collected by our network is an incredible resource, but even if we had 100,000, not 1,000 professionals in that network, it would be impossible to survey everywhere. These models help fill in those other places on the map. Our habitat modeling program takes occurrence data, intersects it with environmental predictor layers, things like soil and climate and land cover. Using machine learning methods, a form of artificial intelligence, we're able to predict where on the landscape similar conditions exist, and that thus where you're likely to have species habitat. The maps on the far side of the graphic show the outputs of that process. At the top, a continuous prediction of relative habitat suitability, and at the bottom, taking that prediction and using it to classify the landscape to identify where there's high and medium probability that local conditions support the species in question. This process is iterative. By tapping into the biological expertise of our staff and network, we're able to review and revise the maps and even use them to direct new field surveys, which improve the quality of models over time. NatureServe's really well positioned to make these maps, both because we have the data from our network to train those models, and we have the human expertise in our network to make sure the artificial intelligence is getting things right. Our modeling process is computationally intensive, but it's also people intensive. We rely on the Will Orndorffs and the Kenda Hermans to tell us if the prediction is a match for what they know is the case on the ground. On the screen, you're looking at the first, second, and third iterations of a model we produced for Apalachicola false rosemary, an endangered plant known from a very small area in Liberty County, Florida. There are only 10 known populations of this plant out there, and many are threatened by habitat destruction. This model shows where else that plant may be found or where habitat could be restored. It's actively being used by the Fish and Wildlife Service to ensure that those areas are suitably evaluated when there's activities that may have an impact. I shared this map earlier, our map of biodiversity importance, but I want to show it again now as it truly synthesizes our field efforts, our conservation status assessment efforts, and our mapping efforts. This map takes those species habitat models, which we produced for over 2,000 of the country's most imperiled species, and stacks them up to show where you have concentrations of at-risk species. Species with smaller range sizes and thus fewer conservation opportunities are weighted higher. I worked closely with Chris to produce this map, but underlying it is the work of network biologists like Will and Kenda, who both collect the data needed to train models and provide expert review. Underlying it is the work of technologists like Dave and Maggie, who build the systems that allow that information to come together. And underlying it is the work of people like Amanda and Tara, whose conservation status ranking work lets us know what species to include in the first place. This is a relatively simple map, but producing it took the work of hundreds of scientists, 50 years of field survey, and deployment of cutting-edge technology. Chris and his team, collaborating with NatureServe ecologists and regional experts in our network, also work to produce ecosystem-based map products like this, which shows different vegetation types across temperate North America. When I mentioned that Chris was up till 3 a.m. the other night, this is what he was working on publishing. These ecosystem products are a good complement to the species-based products that we work on, facilitating landscape scale conservation. One of the things that we're really hearing from the community of conservation practitioners that rely on our data is that while information on individual species is helpful, particularly in situations where those species are at high risk of extinction, managing at the ecosystem level can often be more efficient, especially in efforts to keep common species common. NatureServe spatial analysts, ecologists, and species scientists, together with the experts in our network, are also advancing the development of species habitat relationship data and those ecosystem maps to support multi-species management. That knowledge is great, but it's only great when we can get it into the hands of people who need it to make decisions. And that's where the need to communicate the knowledge we derive comes in. To do that, we need tools that get our information into the hands of decision makers. Lexi Ferry, who's another one of our software engineers, is a person who helps us do that. Where Dave brings decades of experience and an old-time music pedigree, Lexi brings youth, creativity, and really a next generation mindset. I arrived at work early the other morning, and Lexi was in the kitchen practicing her guitar. In her spare time, she leads Girl Scout camping trips and also apparently plays campfire music. I felt really old when I asked her if she could play any James Taylor or Neil Young, which in my mind are quintessential campfire artists, and she had no idea who I was talking about. But that youth brings incredible technology prowess, and Lexi puts it to good use, building tools that allow the world to access our data. Two of those primary tools are NatureServe Explorer and its companion NatureServe Explorer Pro. NatureServe Explorer provides is an open online tool that provides access to the information that's stored in our biotics database. It's where you can go to learn about the species and ecosystems in North America, their conservation status, their conservation needs. Explorer Pro takes the work of Chris and his team, all that mapping, and gets spatial products into the hands of users, both open data and licensed data that provides access to precise locations that can be used for on-the-ground management. These tools and the scientific analyses behind them are having direct on-the-ground impact. They serve our network of state and provincial partners. Having access to the biotic software helps those state programs work more smoothly and efficiently. As I mentioned before, our conservation status ranks are commonly used in state wildlife action plans to identify which species are of greatest conservation need, a special designation that focuses intervention efforts. Federal agencies also rely on our data. Federal agencies manage 30% of the lands in the United States, and to do so well, they need information on the species and ecosystems that occur there. As an example of how we work with some of these federal agencies, the Fish and Wildlife Service considers both our documented occurrence data and our habitat models when prioritizing acquisition areas for the National Wildlife Refuge System. There's a new proposed federal rule out there that designates conservation as a formal use of public lands on par with energy development, grazing, and recreation. Agencies like the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service come to NatureServe to understand what species and ecosystems should be the focus of conservation efforts and identifies areas that are particularly important for managing for conservation. We also work with corporations. For example, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative standard requires management for the persistence of species and ecosystems that have a NatureServe conservation status rank of critically imperiled or imperiled. Without our ranks and without data on where species and ecosystems with those ranks are found, SFI provisions for biodiversity just don't work. As various other types of corporations newly seek to demonstrate that they too operate in a nature-positive manner, NatureServe is the most well-positioned organization to guide development of meaningful biodiversity metrics that are both defensible and science-based. Conservation NGOs are another audience and direct user of our information to direct their actions. Foundations like Pew and Hewlett have come to NatureServe and our data and analyses to help guide their national conservation strategies and figure out where to make investments. NatureServe biodiversity data is integral to products like the Nature Conservancy's Terrestrial Resilience Map, which identifies areas of importance for supporting climate change adaptation. More locally, the information that's being collected by our network and products like the Map of Biodiversity Importance help land trusts know where they should be investing. Our information also contributes to academic understanding of the natural world and conservation priorities. I did a Google Scholar search this morning for NatureServe and returned more than 23,000 unique results. And finally, the information we provide fills a public service, helping the population at large understand this incredible diversity of life that's all around us. This is particularly true for those less well-known species, the insects and mussels and lichens and rare plants of the world. If, for example, you type Tennessee bottled crayfish into Google, your second result is going to be NatureServe Explorer. Your first result is going to be Wikipedia. When you open Wikipedia, you'll see that it relies upon NatureServe Explorer to populate basically the full entry. In 1969, the Cuyahoga River caught on fire, sparking the US environmental movement, the passage of the Endangered Species Act, and formation of the system of biodiversity information centers that form NatureServe's network today. Since our founding in that era 50 years ago, NatureServe has been working to empower conservation. And arguably today, that work is more important than ever. Right now, we're in our own burning earth moment where climate change and expanding human pressure on our natural systems is posing new and frightening challenges. In this context, our work is more important than ever. And our challenge today is to figure out how do we scale up these efforts to address our current crisis. We need to continue what we're doing, but we also need to do more. We need to continue to bring together the network of experts who allow us to understand the natural world around us. And we need to embrace new technologies like AI so that we can do what we do faster and better and in a way that reaches new audiences. Specifically, we're looking at ways to speed up the pace at which we do conservation status assessments. In a world where environmental change is the new constant, there's constant pressure to keep our information up to date. AI, when used in combination with the expertise of our networks, holds some promise there to do that better and faster and meet the need. Likewise, we're figuring out how to measure not just status, but also track trends and understand climate change vulnerabilities. As I mentioned before, we're working to use our information to develop meaningful biodiversity metrics, especially in the corporate side, where we're seeing that new interest in how do we account for and report on biodiversity risk. And we're working to democratize data access, fully building out those tools like NatureServe Explorer and Explorer Pro to make our vast information holdings more accessible and more understandable. working together, this incredible network of experts, the Wills and the Lexis and the Maggies and the Amandas are helping us get there. In doing so, we're setting the stage to protect the incredible array of life that we're lucky to share this planet with. In doing so, we're doing the groundwork necessary to ensure that biodiversity thrives. And with that, I want to thank you all for the support you give us in delivering on that mission. There's many ways that you can continue to help and continue to support NatureServe. We invite you to of course contribute financially, as well as to help connect us with new audiences, foundations, and individuals who similarly care about biodiversity protection and can help us deliver on those goals. We also invite you to collaborate, to join our alumni group, to continue to participate in webinars like this, and volunteer for your local heritage programs. The next slide here has a few resources to invite you to stay connected in various ways. We hope you'll continue to follow us on social media, and again, to think about who else needs to hear this message, who else we can welcome into the broad network of NatureServe supporters who are helping us support the conservation work of all those different audiences. And with that, I think I can open it up to questions.
Thanks so much, Regan. And thank you everyone for participating today. I'm going to, Steve Young from the Arlington Regional Master Naturalist has a question for you, Regan. And let me just, Steve, I'm gonna click the button here and you should be able to speak for yourself and ask your question. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
We can.
All right. So the administration launched a so-called National Nature Assessment fairly recently. This is something that the U.S. Global Change Research Program is sort of the owner of. So they're actually bringing the nature assessment into the overall global change reporting that they've been doing for years. So I'm very interested in how NatureServe is participating or hoping to participate in that process that, it began last year, so it's still pretty fresh.
Yeah, that is a great question and one we are asking ourselves. So I think most specifically, and I may be getting some of the details here wrong, but Bruce Young, who's our acting chief scientist, we nominated him to be part of the advising group for that. We've participated in many of the listening sessions. I think there is a need, though, for many voices to be talking about NatureServe's relevance in that assessment. There's been a little bit of a push that this is a federal thing. The feds can take care of it without, I think, the deep understanding of what NatureServe as this aggregator of state resources really has to bring to the table. So we are eager to figure out the best way to get that message out there as we continue to engage. Right now, there is not dedicated support for NatureServe to engage in that, which hamstrings us in some ways.
Thank you, Regan. We have another question from our friend Healy Hamilton. And Healy, I'm going to click my button if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Karen. Congratulations on an absolutely amazing talk. I was thrilled to see the ecosystem mapping advance. That map was beautiful that you showed of Chris and his work and his team's work. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more. I mean, I saw a tantalizing extent that it goes into Canada. Can you talk a little bit more about the nature of that map and how far along is it and how you're going to communicate it? And then I'm also interested in, I mean, that map is essential for species habitat relationship building, like, trying to build that database of what species are found in what places, which there's increasing need for. And so also wondering if you could speak a little bit to efforts you might have underway to connect species and habitats, and if that information ever becomes available either. Thank you.
Absolutely. So to answer the first question about the map itself, so before you can get to a map, you need a classification of ecosystem types. And that is something NatureServe has been involved in for a long time with development of the National Vegetation Classification. There has been a lot of work in the last year to engage in a national effort to release a new edition of the National Vegetation Classification that takes in the feedback of various state, federal, other ecological experts. So we got the units right? Before you map anything, you need the units. And that work is also being aligned to global efforts to develop a global ecosystem typology by the IUCN. The latest version of the National Vegetation Classification will be released imminently. While we have been working on its development, we will have been working on that map that accompanies it. And that's what you saw on the screen. That classification is hierarchical. So at the very broadest, it's deciduous forest or just forest, and then stepping down, we can parse things out finer to longleaf pine forest or upland dry longleaf pine forest. The map you are looking at is at a mid-level of that classification, what we call NVC groups. Right now, we have finished what we call version 0.9, where we don't quite feel like it's ready for public consumption, but we have put it out to the NatureServe network to review, get that feedback on before we do a release, hopefully timed to coincide with the release of the 2024 National Vegetation Classification. That product's most well developed for the United States. We have done work trying to extend it into temperate Canada, especially, and at higher levels, that broader, deciduous forest type, we've tried to do kind of North America-wide mapping efforts. So the answer, in short, the less satisfying answer is it's not quite ready yet for public release, but it is coming soon. And then Healy, for your second question about species habitat relationships, that is a need we really see. We have done a number of client-specific or regional projects to develop species habitat relationships, particularly in the Southeast. We've built a database, using that vegetation classification, because again, you need that building block of what are you linking things to, taking some of our spatial data, taking our network expertise to get to that list of species that are expected in different habitat types. Right now, as I said, that's most well developed just as sort of regional pilots. But what NatureServe is hoping to do is really integrate that into our core data offerings. So when you pull up a habitat type on NatureServe Explorer, you find that you can access the species that are associated with it. Or you pull up a species and you find out what habitats it occurs in, and then you can go to the map. That is not something we have right now. We have it in targeted environments for targeted vegetation types, but that is what we feel pretty strongly is needed, especially to support multi-species management efforts.
Thank you, Regan. We had a few questions come in prior to the webinar, and I'm not sure how to specify a question, but the topic, Regan, is there are a few folks on our call today who are concerned about our pollinators, particularly moths and butterflies. And I'm just wondering if you can speak to any of the mapping efforts that you're undertaking that address the status of moths and butterflies and other pollinators.
Yeah. So I think that's a great question. I think, I spoke a little bit about how NatureServe often serves the underserved species. And I think for a long time, insects fell into that category and a lot of pollinators. It is something that's gaining a lot more attention. We have had we've been able to do a lot of work in recent years specifically focused on the conservation status of pollinators. So doing those conservation rank assessments, so we even have that idea of what's going on. Related to that, we have also been building habitat models. So the map I showed, the national map I showed, which I included, I think I said, yeah, 2,216 species. We had about 50 of those species were pollinators, were butterflies and moths or bumblebees. We are currently working on an update of that moth where we, or that map where we hope to add in, I believe it's flower flies as well. And then have had targeted projects, for example, developing really highly vetted comprehensive models for things like the monarch butterfly. So that really is an area of high importance and high interest that we are trying to meet the need for with our data.
Well, thank you very much. And I think that covers all of the questions that have come in. But again, I encourage anyone who's still on the call to email either Regan or myself, and we will respond to any questions that might come up for you. And thank you for attending our webinar. And thank you, Regan, for a great presentation.
Thanks very much, everyone, for your time.